a specific person.
Okay, I think we'll get started. Welcome everyone to the first art chat at this Tate Modern. Thank you for having us. I'm here with Laxmi Hussain and Kassia St Clair. Laxmi is an artist based here in London, known for her beautiful depictions of the female body and kind of flux and flow, and known for her use of blue, which we're obviously going to be talking about and getting into a little bit later. She's put her work on so many different things, on the public arts pieces, which you can see in Wembley, where you have your studio, shoes, glasses, all equally beautiful. And it all kind of stemmed from drawing and painting. And she's also got a solo show currently at Aspects in Portsmouth, which you can see until the 14th of July. And Kassia St Clair is a best-selling author, podcaster, and cultural historian. She's known for The Golden Thread, which came out in 2018, Erase the Future, which was published at the end of last year here in the UK, and of course, The Secret Lives of Colour, which is the reason we've invited her to be part of this conversation today. She has some fascinating insights and knowledge about colour and its uses around the world. And yeah, I can't wait to hear some of your anecdotes about that. So welcome to you both. We were talking before about, obviously we're here in relation to the Expressionist show, which hopefully some of you have seen. And thinking about the use of colour as an emotional thing, dominantly. Colour means so many different things, has so many different symbolisms for so many different people, but primarily it's kind of rooted in an emotional response. Where does your relationship with colour, both of you, come in? Like, why are you so passionate about, or maybe we'll start with Laxmi, why do you use blue? Because it started as a kind of unconscious thing that you were drawn to this colour.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your signature.
Yes. And I think most of us, like you start off, you say from such a young age that you have a favourite colour. And I think it always has been blue for me, but I've never really known why. That I was just drawn to this colour. And when in late 2017, I became really, really obsessed with it. And it coincided with when my mum became ill suddenly with cancer. And so for me, it's very much wrapped up in love and in grief and in honouring my mother, who I believe her favourite colour was blue. And it's one of my core memories, like with my mum, having been on an early trip to the Philippines, which is where she's from, and that day that I remember so specifically, she's wearing blue. But it didn't happen overnight. It took time for me to put all the dots together and realise that this is why I'm obsessed with blue. And then it's kind of become a way of life. And I kind of feel quite happy and content in that kind of a relationship. And I'm just obsessed.
The colour for you is kind of rooted in memory and this kind of relationship with your mom, and that way of, like, yeah, you have a sense of belonging, I guess.
Absolutely. And I wasn't a full-time artist. It was very much kind of skimming the surface for me then. So she didn't see this journey, and that's kind of keeping her memory with me.
Beautiful. And Kassia, where does your kind of obsession or passion colour come from? Because you were writing, the book initially came out of a column you were writing about colour for Elle Decoration, and you're now writing about another subject, but why colour, and what's your relationship with it?
So I'd say that I have sort of a twofold relationship with colour. There's a personal aspect as well. My mother was a florist, and so some of my earliest memories are walking home from school and sitting in the flower shop while she closed up. And while she was closing up, she would give me the blooms that hadn't been good enough to make it into the arrangements that day. And she'd tell me to make little, posies out of them, and then they would be, quote unquote, sold at the shop the next day, and I'd get pocket money for the bouquets that I'm pretty sure now she wasn't actually selling. So that was sort of the personal aspect. But then I fell in love with colour again at university. I studied history, and more specifically, I studied the history of women's dress in the 18th century, in the long 18th century in London. And something that I noticed was that a lot of the research that I was doing was looking at letters and newspaper reports and magazine accounts of incredible parties that people were attending, and people were talking a lot about textiles and cloth. And is that my heart beating I can hear? So nervous talking about colour. People were talking a lot about the fabrics that they were acquiring for the outfits they were making for these incredible balls and parties. And they had this whole language of colour that was now unfamiliar. I was living in the same city, I came from the same city. It's only 200 years later, which in historical terms isn't that long. And yet a lot of the colour terms had disappeared. And so I'd have to go away, and if I wanted to find out what that gown looked like that this person was wearing to this incredible party, I'd have to try and find someone else mentioning sitting for a portrait, and maybe they mentioned that in this portrait they were wearing their hair brown pelisse, and then I'd be like, okay, that's what hair brown looks like. But then maybe the portrait has changed over time, maybe the paint has deteriorated. And so I just love the fact that colour was in some ways ephemeral. And so this recognition that I had at university ended up kind of becoming a kind of low-key obsession when I went into journalism and magazine writing. That turned into the column, and then that eventually turned into the book that came out in 2016, which talks about 75 different hues, dyes, and pigments. And so I was able to kind of dip into lots of them.
And I mean, obviously, that book became a bestseller, and I think that also kind of shows how fascinated people are with colour. What kind of things have you learned in researching and doing the book that have really surprised or interested you? Because there's so many stories you go through. Yeah. So what I loved, one of the quotes about your book was that she knows more about colour than Farrow and Ball. What are some of the things that have stuck with you? Because
I have subsequently worked with Farrow and Ball, and it always slightly makes me giggle that I'm like, here's my book, and it says that on the front cover. Lol. So, I mean, colour is so vast, and I always think about it as a little bit like tectonic plates. You have these incredible shifts that can take place over time. So, for example, we tend to think now of pink being a gendered colour and blue being a gendered colour. Pink is for girls and blue is for boys. But that is, firstly, it's kind of more of a Western thing. But also it's really recent. As recently as the beginning of the 20th century, it was, if anything, the other way round. My dad, who was born in 1925, if you talk to him about colour, in fact, pink is his favourite colour, and he doesn't think of pink as being particularly feminine and blue as being sort of more masculine. And so I find it fascinating that these things change so much over time, depending on your context. And then also people have very personal relationships with colour as well. If you had the most incredible childhood memory and it took place in a room where the walls were painted, bright green, that would probably affect the way that you viewed that colour for the rest of your life, and you might have some association with that would linger with you. And so your response to colour is is mediated by so many different things: your language, your culture, your own personal history, and then also, you know, there can be kind of a cultural artifact in a way in relationship to color. So, for example, could someone shout out, or everyone shout out, if you associate a particular color with royalty? Anyone? Purple, red, purple and red. Okay, so the reason why you have that association is because the most expensive dyes in antiquity were purple and red. They were very hard to get hold of. They were expensive. They produced incredible saturated colors. The purple dye came from two types of mollusk. The red dye came from a type of bug that is, you can find sort of various different types of bug that will produce red dye, but the best type came from Central America, and it was shipped over. And that's why we tend to think of royalty with these two colors, because those dyes are really expensive, and so people hoarded them and kept them, and they became symbols of power. And I find that incredible, that even though now we're all using modern synthetic dyes, and there's no difference in price. You'd be shocked if you went into a shop and the red t-shirt cost loads more than the black one, and yet that has left this incredible legacy that we still carry with us, and has meaning to us, a century or more after difference in price has ceased to mean anything to us.
And as an artist that works with this one color, repetitiously, Laxmi, have you found it limiting in any way? And have you also, in terms of people's associations and responses to that color, like Kassia was saying, we have, color elicits such strong associations for people, and blue, particularly thinking of like the artistic heritage of blue, and the things that you may have inherited from, Falvis or Picasso, using, famously these colors, or right up to Eva Klein. So two questions really. Has it been limiting for you, and what kind of responses, reactions do you get?
No, I think because also my canvas is usually something that I choose to complement the blue. It's a challenge that I enjoy, and actually because I have now become a collector of blue, it's also how blue connects to me in my environment, in nature, and I like the way that it reads in those sort of scenarios. But also, it is an homage. It really is. I miss my mum a lot, and to have her with me every day through a colour is actually an interesting challenge. And I always think, am I ever going to get bored of this? But then I open a new pot of blue and I'm just like, yeah, no. But I have developed interesting techniques, I believe, that allow me to showcase my colour. And I think also my story and my obsession with blue is also what people are drawn to and what they're interested in. So when people talk to me about my art or ask me about the colour blue and whether it's ever going to change, my answer has been, up until now, no. But also because things like your connection to colour and your relationship with things change over time, I don't know where that will evolve, and I can't promise that I'll always be blue. But it has become like a collection as well, and when I'm out and about, I am also drawn to blue. I read Maggie Nelson's book Bluettes recently, and I've had it for years, but I just have always read the first few chapters and then stopped. And I read it over Christmas in a day, and I was like, this is exactly the way that I think about blue. It catches my eye, and I'm like, oh, that's a new scenario for me, and it always will be, I think.
And what are some of the things you've learned about blue specifically, Kassia? Because there are, you've devoted a chapter in the book to blue and different hues. There are nuances in the different shades, obviously different associations, but what are some of the things that you can tell us about blue?
So you are not sort of the first artist to have a real obsession with the colour blue, and it's been a really precious colour, precious resource in art history. I'd actually be really fascinated to know whether you always use the same pigment or whether it's all shades of blue.
I should have asked
Mine,
you.
yeah. Sorry. The blue that I use is based on the lapis colour, yes.
Okay, yeah, so that was
Most expensive.
the most expensive. It's you know, that blue, which we call ultramarine, has really had this incredible impact on art history. If you're going to a gallery and you look at medieval art or Renaissance art, you'll very often notice in the West that the Virgin Mary will be painted in blue. And again, this comes down to money. It's because that blue was the most expensive pigment, because almost all the ultramarine that you see in Western art came from a single mine in northeastern Afghanistan called the Sarasang mines. And lapis lazuli was sort of taken in chunks. I'm sure most of you will know what lapis lazuli looks like. It's this semi-precious stone used in jewelry. It looks a little bit like the night sky. It's got sort of a dark blue background. There are sort of traceries of white in it, and you also have kind of iron pyrite, which looks a bit kind of like sparkly gold shimmers. And this stone would be brought up. It would then have to be loaded onto donkeys or camels, and it would sort of make its way onto this network of trade routes that we now think of as the silk routes or silk roads. And some of it would end up coming to Europe, usually through the port of Venice. And actually, this again had a big impact on art history, because artists based in Venice could acquire lumps of lapis lazuli at far better prices than if it then had to travel further through Europe. And so Venetian artists became known for their lavish use of ultramarine. But you also get, because of the cost, you get this bizarre situation where patrons are commissioning art and telling the artist how much ultramarine to use in a painting. And because they don't necessarily always trust the artist to use the ultramarine, the lapis lazuli, in the best way, they think that they might take it all and then sell bits off to kind of make money. They dole out the lapis lazuli day by day. But also the processing of the stone into a usable pigment is really becomes part of an artist's craft. They have to grind down the stone into a powder, and then they have to refine it and because actually, if you just powder lapis lazuli, it's quite ashy, and you need to get just the blue elements out of it. So I just love the fact that the geography and historical trade in a semi-precious stone has had this incredible impact on art history. And now when you look at paintings of the Virgin Mary and that incredible, beautiful blue colour that you see in so many of the paintings, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at an accident of trade routes. You're looking at, a stone that had to travel so many thousands of miles to reach its destination, and really became kind of a point of pride and a point of obsession for so many artists. It was their way of showing devotion. The artists were showing devotion, and the patrons were showing devotion to the Virgin Mary by painting her in this incredibly expensive colour that, for a lot of history was more expensive than gold. So that's what you're looking at when you're looking at that canvas. You're looking at literal preciousness, literal devotion in the form of an expensive pigment being lavished on a canvas.
Amazing. I didn't know much of that. And I mean, when it comes to artists, though, it also obviously then has evolved to have symbolic connotations, to do with longing. Like, it's quite a melancholy, it's rooted quite a lot in a sort of melancholy feeling. But is it only, does it have any other resonances?
I think also, like, in the blue in general, I think for me it is such a deep, rich colour that I almost want to jump in. And for me that feeling is quite visceral. And perhaps it's this illusion of this colour through what we know, or it could be tradition or you know, like you say, culture, blue has somehow always been in my life, and I've always been drawn to it in many different ways. Like, I got married in blue, but I don't know why I did that. And it's just, I think that we, especially when we have great connections with people that we're close to, we want to find ways to reconnect those memories or create new ones, or especially as an artist, it's all about sharing what we're about and what is meaningful to us and what we want to share about other people. And for me, my work is very much about creating these connections that we might not necessarily remember. Motherhood particularly isn't something that we often see in art, especially today. Like, we don't see it a modern version of motherhood so much. And for me, that was really important to depict being a mother of 3. And the fact that I love being a mother, and that I love how challenging it is, that I wanted to see my version of motherhood and in a way connect it to my grief, because that's what I had and that's what I hope that I'm giving, and to share that these connections are worthy of being in art, and perhaps you'll see yourself in that art and also feel that love and that grief all tied up in one, and my history can somehow relate to your history, and we all have that sympathy for one another. That's very much what I want to depict on canvas.
Yeah, it's become this real, this almost reclamation as well, because you're reclaiming it for yourself, from, it being passed down to you directly, your love of this colour, but also, thinking about that lineage of male artists that have used it, and the associations that you mentioned, Kassia, that actually are not that deep-rooted of blue being a masculine colour. So it's interesting to then use it in this way to depict, you exclusively depicting women's bodies at different stages of life and different processes. So I feel like you're starting to show us blue in a new way, by linking that subject with the blue. I think we've got time for some questions, because I'm sure there are some out there. Has anyone got a question for either of them about colour, like a pressing concern? You don't know what colour to choose for something. We have a roving mic out there.
Hello.
Hello.
In my experience, some of the people who are most obsessed with colour have like the most limited palette. I find that interesting. I just wonder if any of you have any thoughts on that.
I do often wonder, if I were to delve into colour, what that would mean. Would it be an explosion? Would it be chaotic? Maybe that might be my future. I think that it's really important that we do explore these things as artists, but I don't know.
I'm not sure if this is really answering your question. It's something that I've noticed as well. I started off in the magazine world and worked at Vogue House, lots of fashion journalists coming in and out, and very often wearing all black. And then when I wrote the book, I suddenly felt a lot of pressure to wear more colour. And even more so, I did a radio interview. I did... oh God, I can't remember what the radio show was now, but it's on Radio 4. And I sat down, and the first question was like, "Why are you wearing black?" I was like, "No one need know. It's radio." You could have said I was wearing anything. Felt very personal. Anyway, that was traumatic. So I've tried to wear a lot of colour, a lot more colour since. I think there's a kind of commitment issue that people have with colour sometimes. I think it feels like a definite choice, whereas more neutral colours feel more easygoing. And so I think people have concerns about that. And if you go back to sort of thinking about what people were wearing in medieval England, for example, when, wearing bright colours was such a symbol and status of wealth. And if you could afford red cloth, by God, you were wearing it. I find that such an interesting reversion to where we are now, where we can buy anything, any colour, you know, that our medieval ancestors could have wished for, and yet so many of us are wearing cream and navy and black. That's history for you. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but.
Do you think it's still possible to make a statement with colour then? Because of its, I guess, availability now, and because it's more of a free-for-all?
For sure. I think you just make different statements. I think when it was so obvious that if, you know, in the past, if you wore purple in, you know, in Roman times, for example, that was such a symbol, a status symbol, because literally most people wouldn't have been able to afford it. Whereas now, the statements that you make can be a lot more subtle. They can be about taste. They can be about fashion. But there's a lot more statements that you can make. And also, I think we have so many more means of sharing visual culture and visual language around colour that you can. It seems to change incredibly quickly. I think the other thing that I was speaking about with someone recently is they were talking about colours that will soon only be available digitally. So you know, if you were to have an avatar, you could dress it in colours that it wouldn't be possible to create physically. So you could, you know, create a very, you know, a soft-looking, very malleable cloth digitally that is highly reflective in a way that you couldn't create the real object for. So there's this whole new world of colour.
Thank you. Got time for one more question, I think.
Hi. I hope this makes sense. How much of colour and the emotion in relation to colour do you think is universal? Because you spoke a bit about how there's Western tradition and then there's also personal association. And how much do you think we just all feel as humans, or is given to us by society or our own lives, if that makes sense?
Thank you for that, because we were debating this before, weren't we?
I think it's really interesting because you said your dad really loved pink, and my dad, his favourite colour was pink. And so even like in his last days, people dressed him in pink all the time. And then because you said that it's also that the roles were, the colours roles were reversed, now I'm wondering, is it that his favourite colour was pink because he was of that generation? But also, I also think about colours in terms of personality. Like when I see a person, I feel their colour sometimes. Like my dad very much feels like a pink person, and like my sister and my youngest, or my eldest, sorry, I feel like they're green people. And it's really interesting in that way that it's about personality, I feel, as well. So yeah.
There have been some experiments done on this. So, for example, a group of people were given given tests, and the tests had different coloured covers, and there was a slight difference in performance. So the people who were given the exams, the tests with red covers, performed slightly worse than the people who were given the exams with blue or green covers. And there have been various other similar experiments, and you can also look at performance of sports teams, and teams who wear red tend to do better. But it's very difficult to unpick whether this is a physical human reaction or whether it is just cultural, whether we just associate red with success. And in order to properly test for that, you'd have to, you know, get a child, never expose them to any culture, and then do tests on them. And I think everyone would have ethical issues around that.
Might have some concerns, yeah. Are there any more questions? Okay, that was a confident, definite yes. Yep.
So yes, essentially again it's going to come down to money. If you're looking at dyes, then, you know, there's actually a bit of a scarcity of really great green dyes. It was quite a difficult colour to make in dye form. Very often you'd have to dye something yellow and then dye something blue. And the blue dyes tended to be a lot more colour fast and harder wearing than the yellow dyes. So what that would mean is that your green clothes would turn blue over time. And you can actually see this if you look at tapestries. They get what is sort of, I think, called blue disease, where essentially the lovely green foliage starts to look like it's, you know, the colour of denim over time. But obviously, if you're wealthier, you can afford to change your clothes more often. So if you're really hankering for green, you get your new green clothes every day, and they keep on looking green for longer. And also, you're probably getting better quality dyes that are more intense. Maybe you could afford to get your cloth from an area that really specialised in green dyes, that had access to, you know, to quality dye ingredients and so on and so forth. So if essentially, you'd expect very wealthy people to have more saturated colours and greens as well as every other colour, and for their clothes to you know, be more green for longer, and that was again a statement of wealth. But in some areas, and particularly in medieval times, there was a bit of a stigma against colour mixing, and so green was sort of a bit frowned on in some areas, and at sometimes, particularly in you know, particularly very religious times in very religious areas, because it was a mixed colour. It was a mix of yellow and green, of yellow and blue, and so it was kind of looked down on because mixing was sort of seen as you know, not quite evil, but sort of a bit suspect, really, which is interesting.
Oh. I think we've run out of time. It goes so quick. Thank you both so much for your generosity and sharing with us. And thanks for coming, everyone. And enjoy the rest of your evening.
Half an hour talk. 2. One.
start if one red button. Yeah. Also, I will wave you.
Here we are testing the microphones for the talk this evening.
Yep, my name is Alice Vincent. This is Hettie Judah, and we're going to talk about plants and art.
Yeah, gardening and spirituality and womanhood.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here, and for so many of you for joining us. My name is Hettie Judah. I'm a writer and curator, and I am joined this evening by Alice Vincent, who is the author of this fabulous book about, well, we're going to talk about a bit about what it's about, but it's basically gardening, feminism, women's histories, all kinds of, and a lot of creativity as well. And we're going to try and somehow meld that into a conversation that's connected to Expressionists exhibition, looking at the work of the Blue Rider Group, and in particular the women in the Blue Rider Group. Alice, I think just as to get us started, it would be really great, I think, for everyone here to get a bit of a sense of what your book is about.
Sure. Thank you, Hettie, for such a lovely introduction. I'm really pleased that you are in this conversation with me because Hettie's very modestly not mentioned what she does, but she is an author and a writer and a curator. And I so enjoyed her show, Acts of Creation, that closed in Bristol very recently, and seemed to deal with a lot of things I've been thinking about motherhood and creativity and womanhood as well. Why Women Grow is a book that I started thinking about 4 years ago in lockdown, in the late hot spring of lockdown, when I was very isolated from the women in my life, and I was also at a cusp of my own womanhood, in that I was in my early 30s and I thought that I would have more time to muck about and, I guess, have a young womanhood or a girlhood. And actually, everybody got engaged, everyone moved to the suburbs, everyone got pregnant, and suddenly our lives looked totally different. I didn't know how to navigate mine. That desire for connection and that desire to find out manifested in interviewing 45 women, the vast majority of whom were strangers, across the country and some further afield, ostensibly to find out what their connection to the land was and why they gardened, but actually to find out how they lived their lives and what womanhood meant to them. And the process of that completely changed my life and completely changed how I understand the way we navigate the planet and the world. And also, it tried to do something that is, I believe, still not done enough and is quite difficult, which is tell the stories of women's input and reciprocity with the land, what we do to the land, because we are the custodians of it frequently, but so much of that history is lost.
One of the things I really loved about the book is that also, I mean, I guess you kind of, I think you probably set yourself up to pretend that you're failing at certain diagnoses, but you very much, you kind of go into things saying, well, you know, do people garden because it's therapeutic? Do they garden to get in touch with their heritage or their home? And actually, you constantly undermine the really simplistic ideas that we have about gardening, and you don't allow it to be an easy answer. You keep a level of complexity to all the way through, which I think is really interesting.
Oh, thank you, Hettie. Yeah, I think it was because I'd heard a lot of things explained to me, not only about gardening, which is something that is deeply important to me, but I've got a complicated relationship with, but also womanhood as well. This notion of Mother Nature, I wanted to trouble that. I wanted to trouble the assumption that people have told me so often that women are good at gardening because they're inherently nurturing. I mean, that's just sexist bullshit. Like, it doesn't necessarily make sense. And so, yeah, and my own prejudices were constantly interrupted. There really was no pretense. Maybe my hunches were off, but I was like, oh, you know, I'd come across somebody who I admired because of the way they had written about their relationship to their heritage and the earth. And then we'd end up talking about something completely different to that. And that made it completely addictive to speak to people. The conversations were so addictive. I definitely spoke to more people than I could possibly ever fit into a book. And I'm still talking to people now. It became a podcast that continues as well.
And I mean, it was, you know, the gardeners, in quotes, that because most of them weren't professional gardeners. In general, they were people that were gardening their own spaces or public spaces, community spaces.
Right.
But the gardeners that you spoke to, most of them you were in touch with because they'd responded to an open call. So it wasn't that you'd kind of gone out looking for a certain type of person. But what's interesting is that there is an overwhelming number of kind of artists, photographers, people from a very creative sphere end up turning up in the book. And I kind of want to go into the book somewhat backwards, because one of the final people that you talk about in the book is Vanessa Bell.
Yeah.
And I think she intersects in a really interesting way with this Expressionists show. She's working in around the same period.
I agree, yeah.
And I guess the point where you're looking at her is maybe a little bit later. But again, this was somebody who you went in with a certain, maybe not expectation, but a degree of hope about what you'd find.
Right.
And again, you were quite frustrated in what you found or you didn't find. Can you talk to us a bit about the relationship between Vanessa Bell, the garden at Chatsworth, and also her as an artist, as a painter?
Yeah. I feel very conscious that I'm talking to a real expert here. I'm not an art historian. That's something I have to state in the book. And that was possibly why I was frustrated or felt very intimidated turning up to Charleston and being, which is the kind of the Sussex country home of, largely always called the Bloomsbury set, but essentially Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, who has kind of her on-off lover, but lifelong collaborator in her practice and life. And Vanessa Bell, so often, maybe it's because I'm part of the words world and literary world, I felt like she'd always been described as Virginia Woolf's sister first, rather than leading light of abstract art in this country and chronically overlooked until long after her death. I mean, I think the first retrospective of Vanessa Bell was in 2017. She died in the 60s. So it never happened in her life. Her work is extraordinary. It has moved me since I was a teenager. I love the colour of it. I loved the sensuality of it. But I also loved the gardens at Charleston, which are interesting because obviously no one's lived there for a long time. They've been grown and respected in a kind of a ghost and a history of what had been there. The gardens at Charleston were made by painters, not gardeners. They happened to be quite good at gardening, and they had a gardener living there, mostly doing manual labor. But as a result, they were built for color. So really interesting choices, which to a modern eye wouldn't look that extraordinary, but given that that was happening 100 years ago was. So a lot of the foliage was gray, and it like kind of Mediterranean plants, which was so unfashionable, like completely radical at the time, because color looks so much better against gray than it does green. That kind of thing. And they would put like these mad pink dianthus, they're called pinks as a common name, up and down the paths, like scarlet, bright cerise pinks. And they would pick the flowers and they'd paint the flowers. But the way that Vanessa Bell writes about gardening and flowers and the seasons in all of her correspondence and her work made me have this hunch. That's all it was. It was a hunch. That I was like, I feel like she was the gardener. I feel like she was the person who created the garden at Charleston. And so all we had to go on was I was very kindly accommodated by the head gardener in the middle of lockdown. And we sat and we went through her letters and we went through her art and we talked about where she sat. Like, she moved her studio from the top room of the house where she looked over the garden. And then her bedroom was the one with the double doors leading out into the garden, and that's where she died. And her relationship with constantly looking out. She also lost her beloved son, Julian, when he was in his 30s, and she planted all these trees for him, and they all died, and she wrote about it. And I just got this sense of this huge connection to the earth. Anyway, so we talked about this, and obviously there's no evidence. There is no evidence. All you can go on is hunch and feeling and a desire to try and, maybe acknowledge some hidden woman's work. And then on the way out, director of the museum was there, and I was introduced, and he said, "Oh, kind of, what are you doing here?" Fair enough. And I explained myself. And he told me to go and look at Roger Fry's archive, because Roger Fry designed the garden. And that just felt like that was the end point. I was just like this is it, isn't it? There's no receipts. All we have here is an instruction to go and look at a man's contribution. And Roger Fry did design the garden, but he did it a long time before Vanessa lived and died there.
Yeah, I mean, number one, there's that sense of you kind of being put back in your box, which is quite abrupt. But also, I mean, I think it's really interesting how gardens become almost like totemic of ephemeral work that becomes part of a history that's very difficult to excavate as well. But I think what's really interesting about Charleston as a place that really connects with this exhibition is this idea of people making spaces for encounters. And it comes across really, really strongly in this exhibition, the importance of women who are essentially holding space for important conversations. So you've got Marion Werefkin, who's obviously, supporting the artists in her circle, whether they're performance artists or painters. And she has these salons, these kind of regular meetings where people can get together and argue about color and ideas and symbolism and spirituality. And then there's also this extraordinary house in Myrna where Gabriela Munter and Kandinsky live, there are so many luscious paintings of it in the exhibition. But clearly both the house and the garden were really important places of encounter. And there are these records of them, they clearly were growing food there in the garden. So the meals that they were all sharing while they were having these very important conversations about art and ideas, they were eating the food that they'd grown. And the colours of the landscape and the shapes of the landscape then started to inform the kinds of paintings that they were making. And I'm really interested also in, obviously, their fascination with colour and symbolism and the way that you can relate colour to emotion, to the world of plants, because this is something that's really present in the plant world as well. And one of the extraordinary gardens that in fact, probably one of the most extraordinary gardens that you write about in the book is called Artemis House, which was developed by a herbalist and gardener called Anne. Can you tell us a bit about Artemis House and describe it and the way that she was using colour and symbolism there as well?
Yeah, so it's funny because when we were just sitting back there, we were talking about how actually it's quite difficult to always remember what you've written, which sounds ridiculous. But one of the few things I can remember writing in Why Women Grow is the description of Anne, or Annie as she's sort of colloquially known among people, McIntyre's garden, which is sort of along the lines of saying, I have been in the dressing rooms of female boutiques. I have been in a women's nightclub at 3 a.m. sharing a stranger's lipstick, and I have never been anywhere that feels as deeply feminine as Anne McIntyre's garden. She moved there in the wake of the breakup of her marriage with her 3 daughters. And as she said to me, well, there's going to be a lot of women here, so we're going to call it after something fierce. And Artemis is fierce. And Annie is in her 70s. She is extraordinary. Her life is like something out of a film. When she was 18, this is in like the late 60s, she just went cross-country to India by herself. She got a job from Richard Branson to work in the first Virgin record store. She moved to a tidal island when she was in her early 20s, and there was no way to get on and off, so that's when she started to forage and got into herbs because all she could eat was dandelions. She is a pioneer of herbal medicine, and she has been doing it so long, an Ayurvedic practitioner as well, but she's been doing it so long that she has seen every trough and furrow of trend of people being into plant medicine, not into plant medicine. Her clinic remains very difficult to book into because there's still a lot of people for whom she is the best. And her garden, she designed it like a spiral. And the concept is that it is planted with herbs that will support a woman at every juncture in her life. And you walk in through this tunnel that is completely planted with roses and raspberry canes, and it's a deeply sensuous experience, and it's not a necessarily pleasant one. And the first time I went around Annie's garden, she invited me to go by myself, and I just had a look around, and then she walked me through it afterwards. And I remember feeling so claustrophobic and strange in this tunnel. And then when she guided me around it the next time, she was like, so now we're going through the birth canal. And I was like, oh, that's why it would have felt weird.
Of course, you use raspberry leaves to alleviate labour pains.
So yeah, and the roses, she said, you know, they're beautiful and they're joyous, but they have thorns, they hurt, you know. So this is, it would go all the way up to top to paradise. But before that, you reach like crone stage, and she planted Angelica, which is a very, very tall structural plant. And she was like, well, you need strength in your old age. There was myrtle at the point at which she was like, you know, you might be getting married because you should plant myrtle for marital well-being. And her understanding of plants is so three-dimensional because she knows all of the healing properties and what it will do for your body at the right time. And I just found it. She also admits by her own measure, she's like, oh, it's a very heteronormative, like quite old-fashioned representation of womanhood, but nevertheless, it was really potent to see that.
Well, I mean, that gives us a very interesting kind of point to segue into also this idea of gardens also becoming like symbolic spaces for people to live non-traditional lives as well. So there are quite a few gardens that you investigate that. And some of them you find quite troubling, where they represent alternative communities, and sometimes you don't find them, you know, sufficiently radical or whatever. But I mean, obviously with Charleston in Sussex, that's a very alternative community. With the Blue Rider Group, these are very alternative communities. These are people living in, you know, in non-married partnerships, who are choosing not to start a family, not to have children. I mean, in fact, there's this kind of great, I think it's a diary written by Marion Werrington where she says, between us sleeps our child art. So she's talking about her relationship, which is very loving, but it's non-sexual. And the idea that what replaces having a child in their relationship is creativity. So you also talked to Claire that started Rainbow Grow, which is in North London, I think, isn't it?
Austin, yeah. Did speak to Claire. Claire is, she's extraordinary, and Rainbow Grow is set up as a community garden with an LGBTQ plus focus to accommodate people who identify in that way. And in Claire's words, to do something that didn't necessarily just be going to the pub. And they welcome all sorts of different kinds of people there. But also, and what I loved about it is that she had made this space, but she, you know, she also kind of was very much the matriarch of that space as well. And garden, and one of the things that I was so struck by in the exhibition was this notion that all of the people in the group were making new understandings of norms and life and relationships, exactly as you were saying. And I definitely encountered a lot of people when I was researching the book who had shrugged off something from their life that had not been serving them. And it's not so simple that like gardening gave them like an outlet that they weren't able, you know, it gave them a sort of freedom. It wasn't that simple necessarily, but it offered them maybe courage or the space or a place to practice their politics or a community or a lover or the confidence or the space to grieve. It gave people that necessary room to grow, but also to do things on their own terms, even if that was just on a balcony. Someone I spoke to who lived in Canary Wharf was working in a very corporate job and living in Canary Wharf, but on that balcony, on the 29th floor of a building in that neck of the woods, she was just growing this incredibly verdant, wild, lawless garden, and that it seemed like such a chink of freedom.
And there's also this idea where I mean, I think there's a point where you kind of say, you know, the plants don't judge you, so you can be whoever you need to be. But there's also something as well about redefining beauty standards that I think is really interesting as well. And it's interesting how it happens both kind of within the grown environment, within the built environment, but I think also personally to people as well. And this is, again, something that's really present with the Expressionist show, where you have, I mean, you you really picked out Elizabeth Epstein's self-portrait as something that really struck you very strongly. And that extraordinary Marianne Werefkin self-portrait, which she's got the kind of glowing orange
irises, extraordinary, yeah.
Yeah, and she's very much doing the whole, like, I am not performing for you, I'm not being the beautiful society hostess, you know, here I am looking fierce. And that also then extends into what we think of as beautiful in a garden as well, which I think is really interesting.
This was more of one of those amazing cumulative awarenesses. It wasn't. It was maybe nudged at occasionally by people I would talk to, be like, "Oh, I think this is beautiful, and I like this doing." But it was more of a kind of slow drip up that over the course of going and seeing all these growing spaces. So everybody I spoke to, I invited them. I was like, number one, can I interview? Number two, can we do it in a place that you've chosen that is a green space? And nearly half of everyone I spoke to was not a land-owning individual with access to private land. So we did the interviews all over the place. Those growing spaces were a really beautiful variety. But seeing them all and seeing the beauty in all of them and the rebellion in all of them was massively poignant, actually, and powerful to me. And everyone is subjected to aesthetic expectation, of course. But I think it's fair to say that the beauty industry historically has made more money out of women than anybody else. And that's something that's put on us pretty much from the minute we turn up. And it was so cool and so important to see that actually in a green space, and whether that's a windowsill, whether that's a 40-foot long garden, these women were persistently making a new standard of beauty for themselves that made them feel powerful and happy and contented. Even if you then walk out the house and you do whatever you do to feel that you are socially acceptable and putting on a face in whatever way that is important to you. It totally changed how I understood what my garden looked like and why I was making it a certain way and who I was doing that for. Because a lot of the way that people were making gardens were doing it purely to satisfy themselves, whether that is in a really radical political upholding or whether that's simply because they love roses and they want to fill the whole place with them.
I mean, there's an extraordinary diversity also of different gardens. So there's a point where you need twice visit an amazing garden that's set up by women in a prison, which is a very, very successful enterprise, but also seemed to completely turn people's lives around as well, which I thought was, I love those encounters. And then people that had, you know, kind of were thinking about the ethics of cut flowers, which is actually one of the more shocking aspects of the book, is thinking about how large the carbon footprint of cut flowers is.
It's horrific.
Which is really disgusting.
It's horrific.
And yeah, there was an extraordinary woman who was working in Norfolk trying to do a kind of ethical, like properly green, environmentally sustainable cut.
And on rented land, yeah, Cell works on rented land. So a lot of the people who make ethical flowers, they own their land, and therefore if it's just sort of at a loss leader, then you're just growing some flowers. But if you have to actually pay your bills, then you really have to make it work.
So just as a kind of final thing I wanted to touch on, this idea of also solidarity between women, which I think is really important because although they're not always working specifically with women, a lot of the women in your book are working with communities, whether that's an incarcerated community, a queer community, a neighborhood community. There was another wonderful, there was a social public garden in Bankside that you talk about with Carol, who runs it. And clearly the women that were part of this whole Blue Rider group also formed a very important community. And I think particularly after bereavement, so Maria Frank Mark and Elizabeth Mack were both bereaved. They both lost their husbands during the First World War. And they became incredibly important chroniclers, as it turned out, of the Blue Rider group. So they were the people that kind of kept the records. But also they, you know, a lot of the women were forming close friendships and were independent of the men in the group as well. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about the connections that you see between gardening and sisterhoods and sorority and these kinds of close bonds between women.
Something that from the very genesis of the book, when I had the idea, I really wanted to examine and look at all-female community gardening communities. And it was actually in some ways where part of the book failed, because while they definitely exist, the lockdown strictures, the limits of time and research and everything else meant that I never went and found and spoke to someone. I spoke to sisters, I spoke to wives, but I didn't manage to find this all-female community. And for a while that felt like a failure. And then I realized that actually everything was interconnected. And there have been, in the wake of the book being written, there have been actually these really wonderful connections being made between people in it that have nothing to do with me, but also that you realize that as in you know the heritage, the inheritance of being a woman gardener, invariably it's like you are connecting to a more deep and grounded inherited sisterhood and, you know, lineage, that we're all passing this on a lot of the time. So yeah, it was, I do believe that there is a sisterhood there, and I have seen it from, you know, the book's been out a couple of years now. No, 1 year. It has felt like 2 because it's been a big year, but
including you're a mother now as well.
Yeah, the book came out 3 weeks before the baby did, so it's been a lot.
It's a bit literal.
Yeah, but they kind of emerged together. I've had the good fortune to talk about it quite a lot, and I've met a lot of people along the way, and people have been very generous with sharing their stories, and you realize that that people are seeing themselves in the stories in the book. They are feeling a sisterhood and a community with what they're reading in the book, and that means a lot. And I think it means that it's quite often, though, those links to sisterhood don't have to be felt person to person. You can resonate in one another's stories.
Thank you so much, Alice. I think we've got time for like 1 or 2 questions. And we've got a roving mic, so if you've got a question for Alice, or indeed for me, put your hand up and we can quickly answer them. We have one over here.
Hello, I have a question about this idea of places of encounter that you raised earlier in the conversation, and maybe how that interacts with inheritance. Perhaps that these spaces can be inherited into the future by next generations, or maybe just by kind of complete strangers. How have your interactions with these people kind of led into what the future of these spaces might be, and maybe what do you think the importance of that is?
I love that question. Thank you. I think that if you are tending to the soil and you are nurturing it and you are putting things into it and you're looking after it, you're inherently doing that, yes, for your own satisfaction, but you are doing it with a very firm understanding of what's going to come next. I did speak to some people specifically about the close ties between their mothering and gardening, and how actually sometimes having a child was the impetus that put them into gardening. I also spoke to a lot of people for whom it had nothing to do with it whatsoever, but I do think that there is this sense that if you are tending the land, you are only a custodian. And that's really important, but you're not necessarily doing it for you. Because how could you look at a tree that's likely to be alive for 70 years? You know, that there is an inherent generosity there. That is very present. And I think even to go back to like Anne's garden, for instance, she was growing that. There was such a future vision in growing that garden. And she's a teacher. She uses that as a teaching device. So that suggests that there are lots and lots of people who are understanding that. Thank you.
I think we've got time for one more question. One almost
Very
next.
conveniently placed next to the mic.
Pass the mic back.
Hello. I guess my question is around your analysis, because I think you opened with saying how, we're talking about women or people who have been societalized as women in growing spaces, and I think you were saying at the start that you were kind of refusing this idea of it's connected to care, and maybe I misinterpreted what you said, but as in, so what do you think the connection is? Because I'm a grower, and I found in non-industrial growing, And I find myself around a lot of women doing the same, and people who've been societalized as women doing that kind of work. And so I guess I'm just curious what you think.
So it was care very much is present, and there it was specifically the word nurture from a really narrow lens of motherhood. As was the thing that I often found difficult to navigate, that assumption from examples such as like, oh well, you know, you're going to be a great mother because you're looking after those plants so well. That kind of thing, which I had heard as someone who's like been writing and talking about gardening for quite a long time, or this belief that all women are inherently good at nurturing because they're meant to reproduce, and that would inherently make us good gardeners as well. That was what I wanted to trouble. It wasn't, I think everybody that I spoke to was incredibly caring, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all women are good at gardening because they are meant to grow things biologically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. I think, yeah, it's kind of like why do we end up finding, so like I feel like the gender split is quite heavily biased towards women or people who are
I agree,
and
and
I
yet
wonder why that is.
Yeah, I think it has possibly always been that way, and yet we end up in a situation which is different now, but traditionally, if you look at like the typical media representation of gardening, and also historically for a long time, even though for centuries women have gardened, and they've gardened to feed people, and they've gardened for medicine, and they've gardened and they've looked after the seeds, and they've been the archivers of all this information. And yet, you know, it wasn't really until the 19th century that middle-class women, it was socially acceptable to garden, even though obviously people who were not of that class did it all the time. And still now, you know, we've got Monty Don and Alan Titchmarsh, and there are present female broadcasters, but, you know, we had a situation, I have a really complicated relationship with Chelsea, but we had a situation where we had the youngest female Best in Show winner last week, and Monty Don and Joe Swift sat on stage on national TV and was like, well, I didn't think that should win. Like, you know, it's still so present. And for me, it's not necessarily about the show gardens, although I do think Ula is fantastic. It's about the fact that we've been doing this work for so long and nobody's been paying attention or classifying it as work, much as happens with growing. It is vitally, vitally important work. I don't need to tell you that, but people don't acknowledge the value of it. And I wanted to do that.
I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Alice, thank you so much for coming and talking about your work.
just to sort of hello, hello, to get look out. And so I'll have the roving mic. Okay, great. Yeah, I'm gonna let Ramona do that. Yeah, we're gonna try 10 minutes, but I know we'll probably 5 minutes.
I'll be ready at 10 minutes over there with the mic, and then you can wave. But I will also wave back at you. I'll wave the mic when it's 5 minutes. In my head, we're going to have 5 minutes question. I'll wave when it's 5 minutes.
Okay. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello. Hello, hello. Ramona, would you like to tell us who you are and what brings you here to the Tate today?
Who are you really, Ramona? My name is Ramona Armitage, and I'm an abstract artist. Is that too quiet?
You'll hear your echo, and if it goes too far, you'll hear your echo disappear. So when you get your disconcerting echo, you're fine.
Yeah? Is that, yeah, cool.
Robyn, would you like to tell us who you are?
I did. I just kind of interrupted you and asked Ramona to reveal
Reveal the true Ramona Armitage.
That's exciting, isn't it? Is this like emergency lighting where we're now all going to have to evacuate? This is part of it, guys. This is an experiment in synesthesia. I'll give them a minute. How comfortable is everyone feeling being so seen? Oh, thank God, back in the dark. Right. Hello, hello, hello. And thank you for coming. Like, we realize it is 9 o'clock at night. Most people are either like dancing or having wine. And it's really thrilling for people to be here because it's thrilling to me because it shows how much interest there is in this relatively new subject. So my name is Katherine Templar-Lewis. I'm a human and cognitive scientist, and my work brings together artists and scientists to drive innovation, to create change, and foster connection. But I really want to start with talking about you, and for you to have a think about yourself, how your brain works, what was happening as you walked through the halls here. Because what if you could actually hear color? Not just imagine it, but as you looked at the art, if you heard sounds in your ears. What if you could taste sound? Not in the way that we know that when you hear music, it changes the taste in your mouth. But if someone said a word like, the Tate, you tasted an acrid, bitter lemon. Or even further than that, what if you were watching television and someone got punched in the face and you felt the pain in your own face? Right? This is the world of synesthesia. This is the world we're here to explore this evening. This is the world where the wiring of the brain is crossed, so that one sense becomes overlapped with another. It's a world that has been talked about since the 17th century, but it wasn't until 2007 that they realized that all the creatives who they thought were being overindulgent, perhaps, or the children they told were over-imaginative, actually had a neural cross-wiring in their brains. That when they saw something, the part of their brain that recognized sound really did light up. And there's 80 different types of synesthesia. That's what we're going to explore today. How does it impact the way we engage in art, make art, the way we know about reality and what it does? And in the next 20 minutes, we're going to be talking to someone from the world of art, the world of science, to look at that. But for you, I want you in half an hour to leave here. And as you go through the corridors, as you look at the art, realize that actually the person beside you might be experiencing something very different. It's an age-old question. Do we perceive reality in the same way? And synesthesia and the neuroscience behind it gives us a hard answer to that. Oh, that's so dramatic. And that hard answer is no, we don't. We see it in different ways. And in an age where citizens are polarized, it is a very humbling experience to realize that you can look at a work of art beside someone and you both see something different. You're having a different truth, but both truths are equally valid. So that is the world we're going to explore. I would like to introduce our guests, first of all. On the far side, we have Robyn Landau. She's a neuroaesthetics expert, co-founder of Kinder Studios, where I myself am privileged enough to be a director. She'll explain what the neuroaesthetics is, don't worry. And Ramona Armitage, who is a mixed media artist. One of her works of art is displayed there. And also a synesthete. She'll explain what that is. And I'd like to thank Dee, who is signing here for us as well. It is an absolute privilege to have you on my left. So, sit down. And we'll also leave some time for questions from you guys as well. But let's start there. Synesthesia. It means a crossing of the senses. But Robyn, let's start with you. Just tell us a little bit about what you do and what is happening in our brains when synesthesia occurs.
Thanks so much, Katherine. So yeah, as Katherine said, I specialize in something called neuroaesthetics, which is the neuroscience of our aesthetic experiences. Specifically how our brains and bodies, in the most simple way to put it, respond to our environments, but really how our brains and bodies respond to art, culture, technology, you name it. And so when you kind of think about the fact of what makes up our environments, you think about sound, visual art, color, smells, even the density of people in the spaces. Neuroaesthetics and neuroscience, which it's a stem of, really shows us that we're hardwired for art, and our brains and bodies are responding to it all the time. So there's a host of research that we can talk about in a whole nother panel, but ultimately neuroaesthetics shows us that art and culture are really, really fundamental to our health, to our well-being, what makes us human. And of course, part of our, sensory experience is really inherently tied up in art and artworks and, our aesthetic experiences itself. So a lot of the time when we think about our senses, we think about the 5 senses that we know and love, but truth be told, there's many more than just the 5. We'll talk about that again another time. And so one of these senses is synesthesia. And so normally the way kind of the brain works is, you have all kind of the senses in different regions of your brain. And of course, your brain is a connected organism and all the senses talk to each other all the time. Every time you're having an experience where you're visually looking at me and you're also listening to the words coming out of my mouth, you're having this cross-modal experience in your brain of this kind of audio-visual coupling to make up this instantaneous moment that you're perceiving here today. But in synesthesia, it's not just kind of the crosstalk between the senses, it's actually the coupling of senses together. Synesthetes actually, their brains work slightly differently. So this coupling, or as one scientist talks about it, a commingling of senses in the brain, which I particularly like because it feels nice to think about your senses mingling together. It creates a whole new experience. So I'll let Ramona kind of speak to her experience specifically as a synesthete, but it really creates a whole new sense on its own. And so this is found in maybe, 1 in 25 people.
Good maths,
have
yes.
synesthesia. So one of you in the room today, or all of you in the room today, probably know someone at least who is a synesthete.
Let's do a test. Hands up, anyone who knows a synesthete. Ooh. Keep your hand up if you are a synesthete. 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. That's probably the right maths.
I'm not very good at doing maths in my head, but I think there's however many people there are in the room, we can test the stat that I've given. But in the end, it's really, I think, the most important thing to remember, that it's not just kind of a sensory coupling within itself, but it's a whole new sense within itself. And it's something that's really, really difficult to measure. And it's also really difficult to explain from the conversations that I've had with synesthetes. So I think I'll leave it there. And I'd really love to hear Ramona's perspective and hear a little bit more about your synesthetic experience.
Thank you. And I think that's why I'm so excited to have you sitting beside me, because you are the person who experiences one form of synesthesia. So I'd love to know a little about, in your own words, what you do, but when you first found out you were a synesthete and how that has either informed or changed your artwork.
Thank you, Katherine. So I have chromesthesia, which is essentially sound, colour and shapes. So my entire practice focuses around music, and I paint different songs, I paint different kind of instruments, different sounds, and it all builds around different music, essentially.
Have you seen the Kandinsky exhibition downstairs?
Yes.
Did you, hands up here who's seen the Kandinsky downstairs yet? Yes. So Kandinsky is a famous synesthete. He also shares the same synesthesia as you, or shared. How did you find his paintings? Did you find you had a sort of sonic reaction to them, or did you find you sort of felt very seen and heard when you saw them?
So it was actually really interesting, because I've never had the opportunity to see any of Kandinsky's work in person before. It was really nice seeing it up close. And it kind of made quite a lot of logical sense to me, which might sound a bit crazy to people because it's quite wild and surreal. But a lot of the shapes and the mark making within his work I can kind of recognize within my own. So it's quite interesting to see the comparison between two people with the same, with synesthesia, and how it kind of is different but still the same.
I think that's really interesting, and I think I love the room, and we'll come back onto that exhibition where they're actually playing some Schoenberg music, which Kandinsky had listened to before creating the work of art. And I'd love to know how this informs your creative process. How do you listen to music? How does it inform your artwork? I'd love if you could take us through, not in detail, what your creative process is and how it's informed by synesthesia.
So my creative process has actually changed quite a lot in the last few years. When I first started making these paintings, I would kind of try do it all in one session. So I'd work for like 5-6 hours straight. I would listen to the song on loop. So you can imagine my Spotify Wrapped every year is pretty predictable. But I was too worried about losing the flow of the painting, so I would try to do it all in one session. Whereas now I kind of spread my process out a lot more. So I always start with a digital sketch now, and I'll usually listen to the song on repeat for about 30 minutes and kind of get the color placement, get the composition, and work out the different layers within Procreate on my iPad. And then that kind of feeds into building up the painting. So I spend a lot of time trying to reflect the movement within the music. So through doing that, I kind of build up lots of layers and layers of color, lots of different types of brushstroke, lots of different mediums, different paint, and that takes quite a lot of time. So usually it will take me up to about 3 or 4 months now for each painting, and I tend to have about 3 or 4 paintings on the go, and I'll switch between each one in between.
Do we have slides for this? I'm wondering if we might have slides for the process as well.
So this is an early process. This is a kind of base layer, and then you can actually...
Ramona, does each painting have a different song?
Yeah, so each painting is based on a different song. So this is a classical song, and that first slide that I showed you a second ago with the pink and yellow is kind of the very bottom layer of this painting. So you can see how it kind of builds up a little by little over time.
And do specific colours all have the same sound or the same sort of type of music?
So for me, I tend to see songs kind of as a whole. So that's why it's quite useful for me to do the digital sketch, because I'll break down the different areas of the song. But to be honest, I'm still very much figuring it out. So I do spend quite a lot of time trying to focus in on certain instruments and on certain vocals. And then we'll do kind of little studies to try work that out. But I think it's going to be a kind of never-ending journey of trying to discover what does what, essentially.
I think to me, obviously with my sort of science head on, I find that really interesting. Does it add to your creative process? Does it underpin it? Or does it, I actually spoke in the research for this, and it's part of our own research. I talked to someone who did the reverse of you. They looked at colours and they translated it into sound, and they said at first it hampered them, because they weren't actually thinking about the balance in the orchestra of their compositions, and they'd come up with these slightly insane compositions that were all like drum heavy. And so they had to learn how to work with it. Do you find that your process is changing as you learn how to work with your synesthesia?
Yeah, definitely. It's completely developing over time. And I think an issue that I have a lot of the time is that stuff that looks away in my head is quite hard to replicate in paint. So I do a lot of kind of trial and error, a lot of learning before I even put paint on the canvas to begin with.
I love that, because there's this word exploration, and it feeds into what creativity is. And we know that there's a higher percentage of synesthetes within the creative arts. But is that because it helps your art, or because you want to express? So I'm going to come back to you, Robyn, and ask again, back to the science. Science is fun. What do we know about creativity in a more neuroscience way, and what can synesthesia sort of tell us about this? Do we? I know the jury's out on this, but but are synesthetes more creative?
Right. Well, I think like kind of in popular culture, even in popular science, a lot of people think, synesthesia and creativity is connected. You have people like Kandinsky, like Lady Gaga, Kanye West, Billie Eilish, loads of people who talk about kind of who say that they're synesthetes and highly creative people. Well, in science, there's never really been a clear link. There's never really been, any sort of definitive study that has linked synesthesia with creativity. However, it's interesting kind of when you pull it apart, because obviously kind of the scientific method can't measure everything. And so, of course, as we mentioned before, loads of the way that we perceive the world is through our senses. So if you think about the fact that people who are synesthetes, they really do have an additional sense. Their perception of the world is different. And I think this is a really important kind of thing to remember, as Katherine alluded to earlier, that all of our perceptions in the world are different. Their world is colored in a different way. And so perhaps they have a broader field in which to choose from. One form of creativity, of which there's many, is called kind of divergent creativity or divergent thinking, where your ability to kind of reach for multiple ideas, multiple perspectives, have a broader basis in which to choose from. And that becomes really important in terms of coming up with lots of different creative ideas. It's also part of the reason that people come up with a lot of creative ideas when they have a psychedelic experience, for example. It's a similar sort of thing where you have a broader basis to choose from. So they do find, for example, that synesthetes do have this because of the additional kind of sensory processing and this additional sense, really. And there's studies that would show, for example, one measure of creativity is called the remote associations task, where people have to kind of come up with a fourth word to match a collection of 3 other words. And they do find that people who are synesthetes score higher on the remote associations test. But really, one of the things that synesthetes do score higher on is this personality trait called openness to experience. And openness to experience is definitively known across the scientific literature as being connected to creativity. People who are more open, more expansive, do generally score higher on various tests of creativity. And so that is a definitive link as a personality trait. And so there's lots of kind of associations, or my favorite word of the moment, as Katherine knows, adjacencies to creativity and synesthesia. But it's not to say that just because you're not synesthetic doesn't mean you're not as creative as somebody else.
Yeah, and that's important to remember. And I think for me, what's exciting about the work and the study into synesthesia is this realization that, you know, openness to experience, being able to put, you know, as you and in your work do very well, different elements together is something we can all nurture and we all actually lose. Now, they think there might be a genetic basis to synesthesia. I don't know if does anyone else in your family, extended family, have synesthesia?
Not that I know of so far.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. A lot of people don't know they have it. They just think everyone knows that Wednesday is blue. You know, it's that sort of thing. And they're like, oh. But so there is a genetic component potentially. But I think the most interesting thing was this realization that they've had that potentially all little children are synesthetic. And when we're born, we have too many neural connections because the brain doesn't know the game until the game is played. And it gets pruned back. And isn't that a wonderful thought that perhaps if we could remain so open to experience, being able to think it's completely fine to put random associations together, we could all be more creative. We could all create in a more synesthetic way. And I think that's the sort of, you know, when I look at your art, that's what it reminds me of. And I'd love to know, how do other people react to your art? Does it spur conversations? Do you ever get anyone, people going, wow, I'm synesthetic?
Yes, it's quite nice, actually. We have a big open studios event down at my studio in Wimbledon. So you get thousands of people in over the weekend, and it's kind of complete range of people coming down. But it's quite nice hearing everyone's different point of view. So you get a mixture. A lot of people who have never heard of synesthesia, they don't know what the word means. And then a lot of people have kind of seen it on TikTok, know exactly what it is. Sometimes you get people that will ask if they have it or if I think they have it. But the most interesting, I think, is you get people that have brains that work in different ways. So there was a really lovely gentleman that came in recently who had aphantasia, which is kind of not being able to picture anything at all. So kind of the opposite of how my brain functions.
You have no visual imaginary in your head at all.
Yeah, so I think it's really lovely. It kind of opens up conversation for people to feel comfortable talking about their kind of different ways that their brain works, which you might not normally have.
And I think that's really lovely because it actually brings me on to a point I want to ask you about, Robyn, which is for anyone who's sitting there wondering, can you train or learn to become a synesthete? You know, what does science so far tell us?
No. I'd love to kind of go into more detail if we had a longer time to talk about it, but ultimately there's been a few different studies that have gone through kind of a process of can you train someone to be synesthetic, where they basically kind of couple colors with letters or words and kind of train people, and the tests get a little bit more difficult week to week and they get rewarded for getting the answers right. And what they found is that there's kind of this, you know, period of very short window where maybe they're synesthetic, maybe it's a little bit of a memory association between the colors, because, you know, when you're synesthetic, for example, as Ramona would share, the color letter associations, for example, if you have this graphene color synesthesia, it never change. Wednesday is always blue, not to everyone, but to the individual, it doesn't change over time. But what they found in the study was it just kind of petered off after a period of time. And the researcher that we spoke with, who told us about it, just said it was incredibly boring. it was incredibly boring kind of training, and so he wouldn't actually recommend that that people do it. But you kind of said something earlier that I thought was really interesting about this idea of being open-minded, and the fact that when children, it is thought that somehow when we're born as children, we're all synesthetic, and then there's this neural pruning that happens ultimately, so our brain can be more efficient. As Katherine said, you have too many neural connections, and your brain is kind of coded for efficiencies. Otherwise, things would just take us ages to do. And I think it's kind of like a really interesting kind of point to labor on, because the whole point of it is, this open-mindedness leads to creativity. And you could almost say in one school of thought that efficiency and open-mindedness are perhaps two opposite ends of the spectrum, because being open-minded means you take time and you look at multiple perspectives and you spend time exploring, and efficiencies don't really give you that time. And so while we're all thankful to the efficiencies in our brain, or else it would take quite a long time even just to put one foot in front of the other, I think it's kind of an interesting point in regards to maximizing your own creativity and taking your time with things.
Yeah, especially in this day and age where it's all about productivity and process. And I agree. And yet, sadly, and this is the work of an amazing neuroscientist called Anil Seth down at the University of Sussex. They couldn't train people. But what they did find relates back to your point, Ramona, that there was a huge amount of perceptual diversity. This is slightly different to neurodiversity. It's a perceptual diversity that people have. And we all have a perceptual diversity. And that's something now that is really interesting to be explored, because, it's about the way we see the world differently. And how could you explain perceptual diversity in like a sentence?
Well, I think perceptual diversity is the fact of, you can also think of it as sensory diversity. The fact that, as we kind of said earlier, like no one in this room is really experiencing the exact same thing. Maybe even the tone and the quality of my voice is being heard auditorily differently for all of you. But there's no way verbally that we could ever really know that. The example I always use is I have a yellow phone case right now, and I pull up my phone case and I say I would describe this phone case as sun yellow, and probably all of you in the room would also describe it as sun yellow. But there's no way of knowing if our sun yellow is the same. And there's no way of even describing that in words. And as we look at kind of this idea of diversity of our sensory and perceptual experiences, or even just accepting differences among people, it's actually quite mesmerizing and I think awe-inspiring to think that you never really should take for gospel that what somebody's experiencing is the same way you are. And I think that very much echoes your point of what you mentioned about your artwork and the way that this other man that you mentioned kind of described it. And so whether you're neurodivergent or neurotypical, we're all incredibly unique individuals with various different sensory processing that's making up our very unique perception of the world and our experiences.
And that's something to be really celebrated, because that's why as a species we do so well, because we bring together as a collective a huge amount of diversity of thinking and imagination. And I'm conscious of time, and we're going to try and leave 5 minutes for questions. So I'm going to ask, before I throw it to the audience, just one more question of you each, talking about perceptual diversity and the way that we all experience the world differently. Ramona, what did you think of the exhibition downstairs, the Impressionist exhibition?
Yeah, it was amazing. It was so interesting seeing all the different versions taking on kind of the same topic.
And just before I forget the questions, where can we find out more about your work?
So you can find me on my website, which is just my name, .co.uk. Also Instagram and TikTok, which is again my name with art at the end.
Okay. Ramona Armitage, write that down. It's amazing work. And Robyn, one final question to you. What did you think? What was your perception of the Impressionist exhibition downstairs?
Yeah, I loved it. It was my first time going today. I particularly liked the room that had like the olefin light in it that allowed you to kind of look at allowed you to kind of see what that synesthetic experience was like, or what your perception of the artwork was like with the different kind of light and visual kind of painting coupling.
Yeah, and I think, it's just for anyone who hasn't seen it, it's absolutely wonderful. I went to see it earlier as well, and I think for me, knowing that Kandinsky and possibly other artists in the room, and apparently women tend to be more synesthetic. There are more women synesthetes than men. I don't know what that means, but that is just what science has found so far. Is this, looking at the paintings, it's a reminder of how the brain works in these incredible ways in creativity, but also just a reminder of human diversity and that difference of truths that we can have. I really think the challenges we face today, if we can use art to help us come to a place where we can understand there can be different truths and both are equally valid, And that's an incredibly powerful thing that art itself can deliver. So on that note, oh look, we've got 6 minutes. This is great. I said we'd have 5 minutes. Like we brought ourselves back a minute. I'm going to throw it to you guys because I'm sure there's some questions. I know there's a roaming mic as well. What questions do you have for any of our panelists? Or if you'd like to share your experience of synesthesia, there's some wild ones out there. Yes, over there. I can just see a hand in the shadows.
Hi. It's a question for either of you. But my question is is the connection, for example, in the case of like sound and music and colors. So is there, if you listen to a song, is it a feeling that you feel that then is described as a color, or is it more of a direct thing that's, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure how to explain that question, but.
Yeah, let's say when you hear a sound, is it a more emotional feel and you sort of, you see what you want to paint? How does it work?
So for me, the best way I find to describe it is like an aura, or a visual aura. So if you've ever had kind of a migraine and you have the lights around the outsides of your eyes, that's kind of the best way that I find people can imagine it themselves. But also when I listen to music, especially with songs, some songs are kind of more interesting than others. It's not 2D for me. It kind of vibrates, it sort of moves, it flows. So it's almost like a tunnel of kind of layers of colour, and definitely more of a 3D way of seeing it in my experience.
That's amazing to hear. And like I said, there's 80 different types of synesthesia, and some people have cross synesthesia. Myself and Robyn have been researching this. If you want to find out more about the diversity of types, you go to, there's an Audible Originals podcast out right now. You'll hear me and Robyn talking about it. It's called Beyond Five Senses. But there we met some synesthetes who, when they're cycling down the road, they can feel the sunlight as a physical touch on their body. And I think that's what's so amazing to hear you put into your own words, because this is a very unique way of experiencing the world. So thank you. An honor. The question back there. Oh, look, the lights are up again. I feel like every time they go up, we're slightly in trouble.
Hello. God, that was so high-pitched. Yeah, my question is kind of 2 parts for Ramona. What do you use to, sound system do you use to listen to the music? And have you tried listening on a kind of more basic sound system versus a higher quality? And is there a difference in how what you get from it?
So I just use my AirPods normally, nothing fancy. But I would definitely like to try and see if there is a difference. But for the time being, I've just been using regular sound system, regular headphones, but maybe we'll find out.
You've never done spatialized sound, Robyn?
Any hardware companies in the room, partnerships with Ramona?
Because there's within that, it's an interesting question, because there is also all diversity. I don't know, Robyn, if you can explain the way we hear it differently.
Well, it's very similar to sensory diversity, really, or perceptual diversity. It's the fact that generally within the human audible hearing range, it's 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. And any frequencies above or below that range, we can't consciously hear with our ears. We can feel it with our bodies, our brains process it. It's how something like binaural beats works, for example. But everybody's different. As we age, our kind of auditory perception changes. It differs across men and women. And so oral diversity is this kind of representation of the fact that we all hear differently. And it might be part of the reason why, some people are more sensitive than others, why some people can also hear those really low frequency vibrations that you might get from your air conditioning unit or something in your office. We won't get into that now. But I was just afraid that if I speak too much about it, then you're all going to actually go home and hear it. And once you hear it, you can't really stop hearing it. But it's really just this representation, again, that we all hear differently as well.
To get that information, so it'll bug you for life. But thank you. Another question. I can see those of hands. I can see a hand there. I can see a hand there. I don't know, whichever. Should we go right up to the front here? Thank you, Rich. Oh, yeah.
because most people don't perceive things in the same way, do you find yourself having to translate your perceptions, or do you find that you have to communicate differently? I mean, how has that experience been when you sort of realize that you don't experience senses in the same way as other people? How have you had to adapt?
Yeah, how did you first explain to someone what was going on? How old were you when you realized?
So I only realized about 8 years ago. So I'd kind of been painting in this way before anyway, but more as a kind of therapy. So to begin with, I was doing more of a figurative practice, and then was kind of doing this type of painting to relax and doing the abstract work to kind of zone out and be able to not sort of think about something too much. So that's initially how I started, and then realized after watching a YouTube video of another artist talking about synesthesia, and was kind of like, everyone has that, I don't understand. Obviously went down a rabbit hole, started Googling everything, read about it a lot, spoke to some people and realized that actually that's not kind of the norm for everyone.
I went the opposite way. I'm quite an imaginative child. I thought I might have it, and there is a test you can do. You can find it online, and I don't.
I was just going to add another anecdote. In the podcast that Katherine and I co-host, Beyond Five Senses, the final episode is synesthesia, and we spoke with a brother-sister duo who have synesthesia, and they have part of their synesthesia is graphene color, seeing words and numbers as colors. And we asked her in the episode, what color is my name? And she said, well, you know, Robyn R is like, it's kind of red, but like the Y is kind of like a browny color. And so actually if your name was spelled with an I, then it would be like more of a tomato red, but the Y is brown. And I said, oh, okay, so my name is kind of like burgundy. And she was like, well, no, it's not really like that, because like each letter is different and it's kind of a cascade of colors. And then she had this funny kind of anecdote with her brother where she was like, you know, we're so used to this as synesthetes where we dumb it down for people because it's just easier to explain, because you can't possibly really explain the complexity of what we're seeing or experiencing. And so obviously I'm not a synesthete myself, but to kind of just share in the anecdote, I thought that was quite insightful, actually.
I was laughing back now going, is it sort of a mud colour? Oh my God, okay, but this is flashing. We've come to time. I know there's more questions, so please come up to afterwards. You know, we're here to chat for a little bit longer. I know this is open for another half hour. If you want to, you can write to Ramona Armitage at, I mean, your website, sorry. You don't have to give away your personal details. What's your website again?
It's ramonaarmitage.co.uk.
Okay. And Robyn Landau at kinderstudios.com.
Give my personal information away.
Yeah, exactly. Oh yeah, you can find her. That is her email. Whoops. Or you can, sorry, I know it. Info at kinderstudios.com. Or
you can go to the website.
You can go to the website. Or Beyond Five Senses, you can find it on Audible. It's been an absolute pleasure to sit beside such a talented artist and a synesthete, and such a great font of knowledge as well. Andy, thank you again for you, and thank you to the audience for coming.